Bill Clinton between 1988 and 1992 was in talks with the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan over the laying of an oil and gas pipeline across Afghanistan on behalf of a US multinational corporation called Unocal, who were interested in taking the gas and oil reserves of Iran and the former Caucasus region of the Soviet Union across Afghanistan to the thirsty markets of India and China and Pakistan. And they negotiated with the Taliban on the basis that Unocal would build this big pipeline, and the Taliban would agree. And in subsequent arrangements and negotiations, the Taliban broke off the negotiations on the basis that the Americans wouldn't give them enough money. But it's interesting to point out that between 1988 and 1992, the Americans were prepared to sit down with the Taliban leadership, were prepared to overlook their heinous attacks on the Afghan population and their 7th century interpretation of the Koran for those 4 years, but now they resurface as a bogeyman. I have to say to you, the way to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan is to assist the democratic and secular forces which exist in Afghanistan and which today are fighting against not just the Taliban, but they're fighting against the imperialist armies that are occupying their country and have done for the past 9 years now. And I have to say this to you, I'm sure you were surprised as I was. And when was it, November? When it was announced from Oslo that Barack Obama had won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. I remember reading it and watching it on TV, and I must have thought the guy who was second must have been gutted. It must have been somebody like Pol Pot who was second on that occasion, because Barack Obama, who has conveyed 130,000 American soldiers, has been given the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Afghanistan. And the same Barack Obama and Gordon Brown told the world in January that essentially we'll be leaving in 18 months' time, which was news to all the military, of course, because they've been saying that they'll be staying there for the next 20 years. But in London in January, Barack Obama and Gordon Brown announced a statement to say that we'll be leaving when the Afghan army and Afghan National Police Force are ready to take, we'll leave when they're ready to take over. In other words, the British and American soldiers who've been there for the last 10 years will leave and hand over responsibility for running Afghanistan's security to the National Afghan Army and the National Afghan Police Force. Well, I've got news for you, and I can exclusively reveal tonight, there is no such thing as the National Afghan Army. And there is no such thing as an Afghan National Police Force either. In truth, the soldiers and the police officers in Afghanistan are paid by and are loyal to the individual warlords who run the districts where they work in. Because when Hamid Karzai, as Wahid mentioned, an American citizen for the last 20 years, returned from California, where he'd been living for the past 20 years, to Afghanistan, and they made him the president, Hamid Karzai didn't conduct democratic elections like we're about to in a general election in Britain. No, he went around and he joined his government together with all the existing warlords, gangsters, rapists and murderers in Afghanistan, and put them in his government, and he put them in his parliament. 65% of the Afghan parliament were appointed by Hamid Karzai. Hamid Karzai effectively broke up Afghanistan and handed them all to the existing warlords who run the countries. And by the way, so when Douglas Alexander, the MP for nearby Paisley, next comes on the telly and insults your intelligence by saying this is a war against the heroin trade that does so much damage to Glasgow and Paisley and the west of Scotland, you can phone him up and say, Douglas, I can tell you the name of the biggest drug dealer in Afghanistan because he's in Hamid Karzai's government and everybody knows it. The drug trade is run by Hamid Karzai and the Afghan regime. This is nothing to do with heroin or opium. This isn't a war about stopping the flood of heroin into the schemes of Glasgow. They know exactly who's running it. The very same people running it before are running it today. And Karzai got all these people together and he divided up the country. and they have billions to each of them to employ the army and a police force and whatever other corrupt officials that they have. And I'm sure Wahid will tell us when you ask him. The national army and police force, especially the police force in Afghanistan, are perhaps the most hated organisation in the whole of Afghanistan because they're absolutely, thoroughly and utterly corrupt. Leave aside the fact that those journalists who aren't embedded will point out that more than 90% of the police force in Afghanistan are daily users of heroin themselves. I don't know what the figures are for Glasgow, but I suggest it's slightly less. But it would give you the impression that they're trying to build a national Afghan army and a national Afghan police force on that basis. Then you may understand why General Sir David Richard, the Chief of Staff of the British military in Afghanistan, has put on record and said, "We'll be in Afghanistan for another 20 years and you better resign yourself to that. Because at this rate, that's the length of time it's going to take to construct any kind of security in Afghanistan." And I want to say to you that the reason Britain and America and British Aerospace and Carlyle Group and the companies that Joan mentioned, the reason they're in Afghanistan is not to give the Afghan people anything. They're not in Afghanistan to give them democracy, to give them women's liberation, to give them freedom from the drug trade or the freedom from the corrupt practices of Karzai's stooge puppet government. They're not there, in fact, to give them anything. They're there to take control of the pipeline that they'll lay and take control of Afghanistan for its geopolitical significance. Because poor wee Afghanistan, the second poorest country in the world after Niger, happens to sit on the border of Russia, China and Pakistan, and not 5 minutes walk, rhetorically speaking, from India. That's its geopolitical location, and that's why the Americans and British want to be located there, and that's what this is all about.